Thank you, Rakesh, for that generous introduction. As I say, look, if my wife would have loved it and if my mother would have believed it, so we just thank you for that. But thank you, Arvind, for inviting me for this very, very important conference. To follow Alan's metaphor, as the last batsman in, I don't know if it can be the pinch hitter, but what I would like to do is to explore that difficult zone between the disarmament debate that we've been having for the last day and a half and the real world of power politics and the unpredictable dynamic that's unfolding in the world. So how do these two intersect? Because I think we all have, those of us who follow this debate, have our own tropes, our own familiar landmarks, our own terminology. But for the statesmen, for governments, for leaders, nuclear disarmament is not the only issue. They're dealing with a whole range of other issues, and how the priorities, the trade-offs that they have to constantly make between various competing imperatives, of course, always creates complications. What I want to do is, I would want to do this by exploring the tension between the traditional framework for nuclear disarmament and arms control and abolition, and what is now being called the present situation has been described as the second nuclear age. Many of you, I'm sure all of you are familiar with the concepts. So let me begin by saying to sum up, what was the old framework with which we have dealt with the nuclear weapons since 1945. I think one element was the balance of power between America and Russia as the two dominant powers at the end of the Cold War. So how do you extend that to the nuclear domain, and how do you make sure that the balance is maintained in the nuclear field? That was one important one element of the framework. The second was, you had to constantly deal with the technological change that was taking place in nuclear weapons and associated technologies, and therefore how do you regulate the technological competition from affecting the balance of power, and to make sure there was stability, there was predictability in the balance of power between the two dominant powers. And the third element was the fixing of a doctrinal consensus between the two powers. The nature of defense versus offense. How do you? What is the best form of deterrence? And how do you have agreed definitions of what is the stabilizing and what is destabilizing? And so this was between the great powers. It can be seen as a balance of power framework. And the counterpoise to this was a concert system. The NPT, for all the demonization that goes on about it in this country, and the doom and gloom in the rest of the world, in the West in particular, that the NPT was a concert by the 5 nuclear weapon powers to lay down the rules for the rest of the world, which is what in Europe, in post-Napoleonic Europe, had a concert of Europe, that big boys get together and set the rules. So it's not a shocking, immoral, unethical attitude, but that's part of a history of international politics, that you had the big powers get together and agree on a set of rules that needs to be used to keep the system as a whole stable, which is you couldn't let the great power balance disturbed by unending proliferation or other stuff that would happen, so they agreed, joined together to say, look, this is the way in which we're going to manage the rest of the proliferation side of it, while we bilaterally manage our balance of power system. So that was the other part. Now, for all the criticism of the NPT, I think compared to where we started, I think it's done reasonably well. In a sense, it's only proliferated 3 guys compared to the predictions in the early 60s, 20, 30, 40. Given that, and I think it's been a reasonable achievement, irrespective of individual judgments about it. So therefore, and within this old framework, there was a third aspect, which was the abolition argument. That abolition is not something external to the old framework. That, as the Prime Minister reminded us yesterday, the first resolution of the first General Assembly talked about it. Then we had the McCloy-Zorin agreement between the Americans and the Russians, 1961, I think. Then you have the NPT, Article 6. Then you have the Gorbachev-Reagan Reykjavik meeting. Then you had a whole range of movements that came in, END, CND, Nuclear Winter, Parliamentarians for Global Action, you name it. A whole range of people through the last 60 or 70 years have continuously demanded abolition. So it's very much part of the discourse that's happened. But now I think this discourse is running into what is being called the second nuclear age, essentially which describes the post-1991 situation in the world. What are the essential elements of this? I mean, I think one, we've shifted, the theater of conflict has shifted from Europe to Asia, that much of the challenges today for disarmament are going to be in Asia and not in Europe. Notwithstanding Ukraine, I believe it's a storm in a teacup. The Americans and Russians will cut a deal at the expense of Ukraine. I think it's not a unreasonable proposition, but I'm sure they'll find ways to go beyond this. But I think the fundamental focus is going to be in Asia, and I think the challenge has to be dealt with. The second aspect, I think, is the power distribution, that we moved from bipolarity to multipolarity. It's no longer a two-person game. People talk about an n-person game. And it's not only state actors, but there are also non-state actors today who are supposed to create more confusion. And then the change in the technological, I mean, it's much easier today. Late entrants don't have to go through Project Manhattan to do the bomb, and it's, in any case, very few moving parts, so it's pretty easy to do it, I think, compared to doing a jet engine. And then there's the whole question of political culture, which is, look, are the Asians, do they think like the West? Or do they believe in the instrumental rationality of nuclear weapons? Or do they culturally autonomous, they got their own world and they don't believe in deterrence? Do they do crazy things? I mean, in a sense, is there a different way in which the Asians approach nuclear weapons? These are some of the issues, and then terrorism, of course, is part of that. That therefore, how does this play out? What is it? What are the contradictions? Where does the contradictions express themselves? Let me just deal with four, I think. The first is the question of Asia. And Asia today is a multipolar Asia. Asia, even at the height of the Cold War, did not fit into the bipolar framework of Europe, and that China didn't buy into the NPT in the beginning because they're part of it. India didn't buy into it. A whole range of us were non-aligned. So the structure has always been somewhat different, but the nuclear capabilities of Asia were relatively inconsequential to the great power balance. So it didn't really matter what they thought. But today, I think, as the capabilities grow, then you think you're going to make a big difference to how this nuclear disarmament is going to play itself out. And if you look at the Asia, there are at least 4 or 5 ways in which people think about nuclear weapons here. One, the Chinese clearly have a problem with the United States. They're not going to merely give up their nuclear weapons just because there is a framework and a sequence that's been unlightened. I think when they refer to appropriate time in which they're going to do it, I mean, there is way in which they value nuclear weapons in a way that many of us might not necessarily appreciate. Then you have the North Korea, Pakistan, Iran, many of who see regime security as critical. So therefore nuclear weapons as a way of preserving the regime's stability or regime security, and that they have a reason why they think they need nuclear weapons. We may not agree with it, but there are those reasons. And then you have countries like Japan and South Korea, which are dependent on the extended deterrence. So therefore they need nuclear weapons. The security framework depends on having somebody else's nuclear weapons, but nevertheless they're nuclear weapons. And in India, perhaps, is an exception in a sense. I mean, we heard from the Prime Minister again yesterday, which is to say, look, I mean, we were a reluctant nuclear builder of nuclear weapons, and essentially we've got it because 2 of our neighbors have it. We wanted to avoid a nuclear blackmail, and we always say, our government always says that, look, abolishing nuclear weapons is in my security interest, because actually, as a realist, I can say, look, it liberates us from the nuclear terrorism that Pakistan does today, and it frees me from strengthening my conventional deterrence. I don't have to depend on nuclear weapons. So there is some argument there when they say nuclear disarmament is good for us. But of course, there's one thing, it's been good for us, and as the Prime Minister himself said, this is not going to happen overnight. So the fact is that our competing variants in terms of how people in Asia think about nuclear weapons, and that's one reason why I think there was hardly any resonance for the 4 horsemen writing this great debate, or Obama getting Nobel Prize must have excited Europeans, or a lot of people in the West. Certainly Europeans gave it to him. But in Asia, it's okay, it's fine. I mean, maybe in India had the most debate, but the rest of the world said, okay, it's not our debate because our problems are fundamentally different. The second aspect, I think, I'll come back to why it was different. The second aspect is the technological change. I mean, that too many levels of the problem. I think the missile defense issue, which has come back in some sense in an East-West context, the ABM treaty and the understanding it provided, that offense-defense thing must be in favor of offense. No, that is breaking down as the expansion of missile defense technologies begin to emerge. Then how does it play out in Asia? It's affected the FMCT talks. It affects the Asian balance of power issues, because China doesn't like missile defenses being deployed close to its territories. The Japanese want to do it. Others are buying into it. So therefore, the offense-defense equation, which could be regulated in the US-Soviet context, cannot really be done here, because it's spreading pretty rapidly and all along the Chinese periphery, and the Chinese have issues with it. And then there is the whole question of the blurring distinction between nuclear and the conventional. That those of you familiar with Europe, what happened in Europe in the 80s, the problem of a regional superiority, regional conventional superiority of the Russians in Europe had to be dealt with. And the Americans said, look, TNF, maybe it works a little bit, it doesn't work a little bit. Then we need to have the air-land battle. That the idea that, look, you're going to create an aggressive military doctrine that deals with the Russian conventional military superiority, but prevents escalation to the nuclear level by having a capacity to, preemptive strikes across the central dividing line. Something similar is being done in Asia today. It's called the air-sea battle. It's not surprised that most of these tensions are on sea. So the air-sea battle raises exactly the same issues. That the strategy of, the Chinese strategy of, A2AD, the American strategy of, air-sea battle, both would involve rapid escalation using conventional options to deal with a potential crisis. And I think this is a whole complete new ball game that's being played out. And I think, and is further complicated by the emergence of the question of cyber issues and how cyber and space feed into the nuclear balance here. So we are in a very different domain than the way in which we dealt with the US-Russian balance in Europe. A third set of issues is on doctrine. As I said, Pakistanis, for example, our cousins were brilliant, I think, in imagining a different use for nuclear weapons, and not to say, look, this is going to stabilize our relationship, but essentially saying, look, it gives me immunity to do things. Let's see what you do. And I think India has still not found an answer. I think that's a fact, that there are innovative ways in which the Asians have used nuclear weapons than the traditional understanding of nuclear weapons in the West. So that brings me to the last set of issues, which is, now to deal with this, the old order, the old security order is breaking down in Asia. That while the technological thing is creating a whole range of problems, the old order is breaking down. And I think it's breaking down because essentially there is a change in the distribution of power. We always talk about Asia rising and how China's growth has helped Asia rebalance the world. But the problem is also the balance of power within Asia is changing. Because China's rise also transforms the internal balance of power in Asia, and it affects the Japanese, it affects the Indians, and I think much of the issues in relation to nuclear will come into this, and I think there the whole question of how we think about nuclear weapons. If the Chinese modernization continues, is the question of American extended deterrence, is that going to work for the Japanese? So the whole range of new issues that can we rely on the Americans to provide security for us. I think that's a question that's being debated in Northeast Asia. And there I think the fact is this, that alliances were key to keeping nuclear stability. We are a non-aligned nation, so we don't, big country, we can afford to be non-aligned. But for many people, alignment was part of the strategy. Extended deterrence was part of a national security strategy. There's nothing wrong with that. Most countries have done it through history. And now the question is, if the relative balance between China and the US begins to change in favor of China, even in a regional sense, what should the rest of Asia on the periphery of China think about the nuclear weapons? Would they do unilateral solutions? Or would they go to the Americans and say, look, more deterrence? Or would they seek a structure, a cooperative security or a regional security structure that could alter? But the fact is, that brings me to the very last point, that the existing security structures are not working. Because the change in balance of power is already complicated all the great ASEAN-led regional security institutions. None of them are working. In fact, the growth of the Chinese power is creating jitters all around, whether it is because of maritime territorial disputes or a whole range of things, that the other structure does not work. So the whole nuclear disarmament argument, look, we can do collective security at a global level. Of course, I'm not a skeptic who says, look, to abolish nuclear weapons, we need world government that will take care of everybody's concerns all the time, forever. But the question is, even a cooperative security arrangement, somewhat less, is going to be very difficult to construct in Asia. So therefore, what do we do? That brings me to that the old system was successful because it maintained balance of power. The NPT system, the US-Russian system, was successful because it maintained balance of power. So I would say, paradoxically, that the road to nuclear disarmament will still depend upon constructing a stable balance of power in Asia. And in the short term, at least, nuclear weapons will be part of it. So how do we regulate this? How do we structure this? Should be very much part of our agenda. And I think it's not enough to give a schematic structure. This is my sequence, this is what I'm going to do, and bingo, 20 years down the road, we're in a nuclear weapon-free world. It's not going to happen. I think we have to grow through this complex balancing process within the region that will satisfy at least major powers in the region, which takes us back to the notion of a concert. That is, we can't keep everybody in the room, but some people have to get together and say, look, what are the new rules for managing the nuclear problem in Asia, and how can it fit into our long-term goal of eliminating nuclear weapons? And I think that's where I think India has moved to realism. I think that I don't see a contradiction between calling for abolition and for calling for having nuclear weapons for now. And I think, as I said, India was a reluctant weaponizer. And I think while you wait for that world to arrive, you've got to do a range of things. And I think constructing a stable balance of power between India, China, Japan, and the role of the US in this part of the world are going to be the ones that's going to shape the future of nuclear weapons in Asia. Thank you, Rakesh.